Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We'd like to take an opportunity and welcome you to the 2021 National PTA Virtual Convention. My name is Alvin Gainey, and I am the chair of the National PTA's Nominating and Leadership Recruitment Committee, better known as NLRC. Today, I'm joined by Diana McDonald, Bonnie Russell, and Denise Soltz, who also serve as members of the committee. So, before we get into the workshop, I'd like to recognize the other members of the committee. Also serving are Angie Gonzalez-Carver, Denise Hensley McLean, Etta Taylor, and the work of our committee is a rather tall task, and we are fortunate to be supported by two phenomenal staff liaisons, Fatima Collins and Amy Sheldon. So, let's jump right in. At this point, without asking you to raise your hands or really kind of identify yourself in the chat function, I'm almost certain that each of you have likely experienced a nominating committee that you felt didn't quite get it right. Well, guess what? All of us have before as well. And that's the reason that we're here today. We want to hear from you from the field to be able to better address the questions and concerns that you may have coming from your local, council, or even state level. With that being said, we invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat box, and more importantly, drop your questions in there. And the members of NLRC will be interacting with you throughout the course of this workshop. So, before we start down the rabbit hole known as nominating committees, let's identify a few common problems. First common problem is the recycling of the same old leadership. I know that somewhere out there, there's someone that has seen what I like to call PTA musical chairs, where you're in one position this term and then you move over here for the next one. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen it. I've seen it in many years. Leaders simply serve a term in one office and seemingly move over to the next one for another year or so. And a year or so later, the same thing happens again and again and again until they've served in almost every position known to man. They even create new positions. Now, having a willingness to serve and doing so when necessary is admirable. But doing it just to stay involved is not a good thing. And it does nothing to foster emerging leaders, nor does it foster growth within any organization, especially PTA. Another common song that you will hear people sing is the hymn that I like to call, "But we don't have anyone willing to step up." As you can imagine, that's my least favorite song. And today I hope that we will be able to equip you with strategies that will help you to better approach the nominating process, either again at your local, council, or even state levels. And of course, we never want to hear anyone utter those words again. We don't have enough volunteers. And of course, our final common problem, it's the cliquish behavior that PTA has become known for. Again, I hope that we will leave equipped today to dispel the myth of cliques within PTA, because it is one of the largest dysfunctions that PTA suffers through today and we have in the past. So now that we've identified some of the common problems associated with identifying emerging leaders, I think we should start off with the good. It's always good to start off on a good foot. I think it's worth mentioning that effective, good work of the nominating committee will touch upon every strategic measurable of your PTA. It'll support your strategic plan and will further the mission overall. Now, when the work of the nominating committee is done right, it can be a beautiful thing. The work of the nominating committee should be ongoing and is the optimal way to engage leaders and members throughout the course of a term versus electing a nominating committee for a specific shorter period of time. By electing the committee for a longer period of time, You provide an opportunity to observe members in their element. The nominating committee is able to see how volunteer leaders interact with others, as well as get a sense of their leadership styles, as well as get a better understanding of what motivates a person. The committee should take the opportunity to engage volunteer leaders from within PTA, as well as like-minded or allied organizations. There are so many organizations whose work mirrors that of PTA, and many of them have been our partners for years. But aside from the occasional interaction and support around specific issues, we don't seem to engage those members and leaders from those other organizations, especially not for the growth and benefit of PTA. Why are we not encouraging the membership and involvement of those individuals while tapping into a completely new source of volunteer talent? In my opinion, one of the most important jobs of a nominating committee, aside from identifying talent, is to cultivate new leaders. When you're engaged in a nominating process, you will undoubtedly come into contact with volunteers that are great. They have many of the things you're looking for. They check all the boxes, but they just may not be the full package. Well, the best thing that you can do is to cultivate that person. They may not be the best fit now, but they can be in the future if they are properly coached and mentored. Cultivating talent is truly the lifeblood and provides for future sustainability of PTA. It's just as important as membership. It is also important to note that the nominating committee has a responsibility of ensuring that leaders reflect the populations that they serve. The committee runs the best chance of improving the diversity of a PTA through its work. They see the needs of the organization, and they should be able to identify leaders that fit those needs. When certain populations are underrepresented, the nominating committee holds in their hands the opportunity and power of bringing people to the table that represent a wide range of communities and populations. Then, of course, it's important that volunteer leaders are empowered. They need to have an understanding of the organization's mission, strategic vision, and have their idea of what they will bring to the table. Bonnie, I do believe it's over to you to talk a little bit about the bad.
Actually, Alvin, it's me. I know you're all surprised that they would give me the bad, but I am going to acknowledge a couple things that have been happening this last couple years in our PTAs. And that is that as leaders, we never thought we would be dealing with a pandemic, that our families would be suffering the way that they have, and that our schools would not be in session. And that certainly has made an impact on cultivating and finding new leaders, and in fact, even meeting together. And so we do want to acknowledge what you all have been through as local leaders and appreciate those of you who have stepped up. But I do think that that actually leads us to an opportunity to engage right now, because one of the things that PTA has always said is that family engagement and engagement with our parents is the number one key to the success of our students. And I do think that our PTAs have an opportunity right now to acknowledge that we have not always been doing that at our schools. And so by acknowledging what isn't working, in fact, in our PTAs, we have an opportunity to look at the silver lining, that we can engage our parents because we know that we need to make sure that there is success, not just for our students, but the longevity of our association. So next slide, Alvin. We've already determined what actually works for a sustainable nominating committee, but we do need to make sure that we're acknowledging some of the things that we found in the past that didn't work. When nominating committees are working well together and they're looking for new leaders and they're making sure that the leaders that they're choosing for their roles are aligned with growth and opportunity, it's great. Like Alvin said, it's a beautiful thing. But when nominating committees don't quite get it right, or they haven't had the time to make sure that they're engaging new leaders, that they're really looking for that diversity to represent the students that are in our schools, what does that do to us? We know that it actually impacts the growth of our PTAs. As Alvin said, the recycling of new leaders or past leaders, is problematic, right? We've seen it. I've actually been in an audience before at a convention where I had new leaders out there with me saying, did they just switch places? We don't want to have that happen. It actually makes it so that there's no sustainability, because eventually we're going to move on. Whether we have kids in grammar school, we move to a middle school, who's left behind if we're not constantly looking for that new leadership? It also makes it so that we don't have faith in the brand of PTA. And as Alvin said, if you're seeming to be a cliquish PTA, that's because you are a cliquish PTA. So what do we do to get out of our comfort zone to engage new leaders? And that's some of the things that a nominating committee can do. Next slide. When we don't have consistent new leadership being infused in our association, we do see the problems with that, right? We become stagnant with new ideas. We do see a decline in membership. And right now, we actually have a lot of work that we need to do as our PTAs to work on the decline that we've seen over the last year and a half. And I do think that you do have an opportunity right now. We're all going to see growth because we're going to be back in school, and we know that parents are going to be excited about being engaged. And so this is your opportunity to get them involved at a local level, to get them involved at a regional or the state level, because we need them. So declining revenue, right? Membership and how we have involvement actually impacts our revenue. And of course, the relevance. If we are not relevant, if we do not look like our students in our school, we are not going to be relevant. You cannot consistently elect people that actually look like me. We need to make sure that we are doing a focus on getting other people involved in our PTAs. And so I'm constantly looking at these three things. We're looking at them as a nominating committee. If you don't have members, you don't have a leader. If you don't have a leader, you're not going to have an advocate. And so with that kind of in mind, just realize what the nominating committee has the power to do for that sustainability. Next slide, Alvin. As we said, the recycling of leaders is one of the most detrimental things that we can do for our PTAs. And it doesn't mean that seasoned leaders, and we don't use the word old, but seasoned leaders in PTA are not something that we need to have. But what is your individual role as a nominating committee member? What is it that you're supposed to be doing? And I think that one of the things that we want to make sure we're doing is having a balance of new and seasoned leaders on our boards. We want to make sure that you have some people that have that historical information, but as an individual that's already in the role, what is your role as well? And I would like to think that one of your roles, not just doing your job description, not just being that leader that is consistently there and leading something better than the way that they left it, but looking for your recruitment, like who's going to replace you, right? Who is it that I can develop as a leader while in that role? That helps the nominating committee. So don't forget that as a leader in your schools. And then looking at from a nominating committees, if we're just recycling our leaders, you better be calling that out. If you're the one that's on that nominating committee and you're seeing that we're just changing places again, you're the one that's responsible to say, I think we need to do more work. If you only have a few people that show up in the room, what is it that you're going to do? And what is it that you're going to do to hold the board accountable? And I know some of you might even be saying, what nominating committee? What are you even talking about, Diana? Because some of our local level leaders, our unit leaders, they don't even have a nominating committee. So really making sure that there's a focus on that for that sustainability is going to be critical. And then, as Alvin said, what do we do with leaders that have been around for a while? What do we do when somebody wants to constantly be involved? Is there a way to set up a mentoring process so that we don't actually have them go away completely? But how do we work with that new leader? It is hard to actually say, okay, I'm done and I don't want to do this. PTA is in our heart. We want to consistently be involved. But for the sustainability of the organization, how do we have those seasoned leaders connect with new leaders and mentor them so that they're successful in their role? And one of the things that I love to say this past term, I was on the membership commission and I told the vice president, I've already done all this work. I was state president. I don't need to do it anymore. What I want to do is give my ideas and show a new leader how to do it. But I actually don't want to do the work. So how do you do that as a seasoned leader? How do you cultivate and work with new leaders, whether you're on the nominating committee or you're in a role of a longtime member and supporter of the PTA? So now we're going to get into some of the best practices of a nominating committee and what you can do locally.
Thank you, Alvin and Diana. Those are all great points. And now I am going to talk about best practices, and I know it's what you've all been waiting for. I think every nominating committee should be passing on the practices that work the best. The ones that didn't go so well, and the oops, oh my gosh, please tell me we're never going to do that again. But first, you have to have a solid nominating committee that is established enough to pass things on. Sometimes your practices for new officers is so off kilter, you have no choice but to start building more from the bottom up than you thought you would have to. But that's why we're here to help you. So the title says your nominating committee. And there are two major things I would like to point out on this slide. The word independent is the first thing. Does it feel like your officers are handpicked by the president? Going back to what Alvin said, are you playing exchange an officer where the same people pop up all the time, just in different chairs? Does it seem like it's a clique or a my friends only club? If any of this sounds familiar to you, you are noticing red flags and you need to take some steps to effect change. Your value of your leadership team is diminished when your leadership pool is smaller than who fits into a plastic kiddie swimming pool. And what happens when that small volunteer pool graduates out, as Diana mentioned, it leaves behind a void of knowledge that's so hard to overcome. It can potentially freeze out new ideas. It can end up in some volunteer resentment, and it can make you feel like your pool has no water in it. Being independent means you operate outside of the officer team and away from the influence of school administration. Remember, you're a separate 501c3 not-for-profit business, and you're looking for the best leadership you can find for the sake of the children in that building. Every advocate in that building is a voice for children and a potential officer as well, and you're looking for the ones who shout out the best message of love and encouragement. The second thing I'd like to point out is as stipulated in your bylaws. I'm going to say this more than once. You need to start out by knowing what guidelines are already laid out for you. This is where I see people get stymied sometimes. They can't find their bylaws, or they ask and they don't get a copy, and they shrug and they move on without them. Well, I'm going to challenge you to dig in and get what you need to do your best work. Ask for the documents that pertain to your work and make sure you get them. And if you find that your guidelines are slim or not at all, then you have the opportunity to create best practices, and you can reach out and you can let others give you the benefit of their experience. I've seen bylaws be very specific. Some state which officers are elected or when the nominated slate needs to be turned in, who gets the information. It might state when the new officers take over and the length of the term, but I don't very often see bylaws that tell you when you should start working on a new slate of officers. We seem to be more concerned about when to report out than when to get the engines revved up and running. And my guidance is the time to start is always. Let's go on to the next slide, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail. Again, referring to your governing rules, your bylaws, your standing rules. If you feel like you have little or no guidance in these documents, then take the time to discuss where you feel you've been having issues and search out resource sources that help you make changes based on your process for changing your bylaws or your standing rules. So you are firming up the process, not just for you, but for all future committees as well. And this is where Google can be your friend. If you type the words nominating committee into a Google search bar, you're going to get 10,200,000 results in 0.57 seconds. Now, that's not so difficult, right? But the hard part is figuring out which one of these responses are fit for you and your team. And this is where being a PTA is an advantage. You may have council or regional leadership you can reach out to. You may be part of a district or a county. You're part of a state, and then there's always us here at National. The benefit of all of these are that they have failed and made mistakes long before you have, and they've recovered, and they would love to share and tell you how they did it. And if this doesn't work, we also have a PTA Local Leaders Facebook page. You have peeps. You just have to know how to use them. Just make sure that the advice you get and that what you want to use doesn't conflict with any of your own governing documents. I think the size of a committee is important. It should always be an odd number, and I personally like 5 or 7, depending on the size of your school population. Because you're not just picking leadership, you're seeking out leadership. And if you have 5 to 7 members, you can take turn going to events, listening in on meetings, asking teachers who is volunteering in classrooms. And those are your starting pool of your next candidates for office. One piece of advice here. During the course of a year, I have heard many nominating committee members say, "Hey, you'd be a good officer." You may have accidentally given this person the impression it's a done deal. And usually it isn't. Don't breach trust by doing something like that. It's not the best approach. Maybe start out by being more specific. Hey, have you ever thought about putting your name in to be vice president of membership? I've been watching, and you have a great ability to pull in different people. You pull them in at every event, and you treat them with respect, and you listen to their ideas. This helps them see that you care, but it also helps them see that you noticed them. And then you can follow up with, we have a talent bank form, and you can fill it out or maybe turn it into a letter of interest. Can we have a call sometime or find some time to sit down? And let me give you some more details. In my opinion, it makes you more relatable. It allows you to set up some one-on-one time, and it gets that little professional vibe going in your process. Don't forget, you're a not-for-profit business. It also gets their buy-in because they have to do something to apply. They can't just sit and wait for an open position to be bestowed upon them. Cast your net far and wide when you're looking for good candidates. Are there community members that bring a skill set that would make your PTA better? I believe it was Alvin that mentioned working with other associations that have common interest. What about teachers and school personnel? As long as it's not against their district policy, they are also your partners. I also like to have a timeline to the process. So if you need to report on your list of candidates, say at your February PTA meeting, January 2nd to start your search, you're cutting it close. Because guess what? People do say no. Shocker, right? And if they do, and you only have one candidate in mind, you have some scrambling to do. So think about your timeline with some time padded in for bumps in the road because you're going to hit them. One of the last points I really want to talk about before I pass this off to Bonnie is something that seems so obvious, but I see it violated all the time. Practice confidentiality in all of the committee work, not just during your deliberations for a candidate, but when you're talking to candidates to see if they will consider filling out that LOI, and also after you're finished and the slate has been announced. There is nothing more deflating for one of your candidates than to find out they were the fourth choice. You're not setting them up for success if you're making them feel like the last kid called for the baseball team. And you certainly don't want the entire school gossiping about why a candidate didn't get chosen or why they chose not to serve. Please don't turn away your potential candidates by not respecting their process, their privacy, as well as that of the committee. Well, as you can tell, I could talk about this for hours, but Bonnie has some great information coming up that I know you'll be able to use. And so I'm going to turn it over. Bonnie?
Thanks, Denise. That was a great setup. What I'm going to be talking about is a continuation of the best practices. And one of the things that we like to talk a lot about are what are called competencies. And that's not easy to say. So I dare you to try to say that in front of people really fast. So one of the things when we were talking about this as a group the other day is we decided, you know what, why don't we place a sample of some of these competencies up here? Now, I don't know about you, but I would need probably a microscope to look at that, or one of the handheld ones. So I'm just going to mention to you some of the items that are on that competency list, and to let you know that that is actually a list that was put together with the work of National PTA, NLRC, and consultants that are experts at this. And it is actually on the National PTA website. And it used to be under what is called LOI, but it is actually now, make a note of this, Run Your PTA, Become a Leader. And you will find the board competencies PDF on there. And it's really kind of important because one of the things, Denise and we've all been talking about today is what to look for. Well, how do you know what to look for? And so some of the things that are on this list that you would, again, need, something like this to look at is personal integrity. Something that you would think, well, of course. But would you have written that down on a list when you got together to talk? Maybe, maybe not. Strategic and courageous thinking. We need more of that now more than ever, especially after what Diana talked about. We've got a lot of rebuilding to do. We need leaders that are going to think strategically and willing to think outside the box. They also have to have that financial knowledge, not necessarily just to be the treasurer, but if you have a leader that's in there that doesn't understand that everybody is responsible on an executive board, on your team, that's critical. We need everyone to understand that. Other things that you will see, I'm not going to read them all, but effective communication. If you have leaders that cannot communicate, you're going to have problems. Accountability, both them and keeping other people accountable. Diversity, we've talked a lot about. Diversity, equity, inclusion. A big one for all of us that are PTA is advocacy. Do they advocate? Do they know how to advocate? Accountability we talked about, and another one is inspiring leadership. And there will be other ones on here that I may not have mentioned. And I think Diana may want to help us with one of those.
Sure. This is something that I talk about all the time. And I think one of the things that we miss a lot of times is having a sense of humor, because we know as leaders, things are not always going to go as planned. So having a sense of humor, being able to lighten the mood when things aren't going exactly right is a critical component to being a great leader. So think about people who have that personality that can reach out to other people and make people feel at ease when things do go awry.
Thank you, Diana. Because the other thing that we're going to talk about is identifying skill sets. And so these competencies help us to look at those. But what you have to do is we think, okay, as a nominating committee, we're looking out to what can be offered to us in these competencies. But one of the things we do with NLRC is we look at, for instance, the current board and what competencies do they have right now. And then we look at who's going to be leaving that board this year. That's critical because in a few minutes, we're going to talk about gap analysis. And that's how we identify where are we going to need to fill in the blanks, so to speak. So at a unit level, you can do the same thing, especially if you've had a lot of rotation going on, which we have been talking about. You could probably identify a lot of skill sets that are missing. You can probably identify a gap that is going to need to be filled. And so if you don't know what needs to be filled, how do you know what you're looking for? And here's an example. I have been on boards at multiple levels before that have had, let's say, just an example, 6 officers. 4 of them have background in advocacy, and 2 have, maybe field support. That's not a great balance, guys. So when we go back in to look, it's kind of like, what do we need in terms of fulfilling everything we need to do to make that strategic plan happen? We can't do it if all we have are advocacy people, although we need them. And I've seen it flip-flop. And then all of a sudden, all we have are field people. You need to help find that balance. And so doing these steps on these bullets helps us to focus the search on the needs of the board. What are we going to need to accomplish everything that needs to be done? And one other thing that we haven't talked a lot about, we've talked about diversity, making sure that your board looks like the students that you support, which is critical. But one thing that people forget about sometimes has to do with geography. And I know, especially in our state, and even in our state, we have regions. They can be called districts, they can be called councils or counties. Many of the states are like that. You don't want to have a board made up of everybody from downstate and nobody from upstate. In your unit, if you have some of the units down south are huge, you have many neighborhoods. You also want to look at that geographic representation, because that voice is going to be different from neighborhood to neighborhood, from county to county. And at a national level, it's going to be different from state to state, which you may have noticed if you see our slate come over, is we really try very hard. We actually take a map out and we take a look at, identifying where do we have certain people located, where are our gaps. We also look at, from our perspective, large states, middle states, petite states. Are we making sure that our whole nation is made up of all of these different things? Do we have that representation? We'll go on to the next one, Elvin. And I think no warm body speaks for itself at this point. I think we've kind of gotten that one out there. So the next thing is engagement leads to retention. If someone feels like they are not wanted, if they keep writing their name down on a volunteer list or on a nominating form and no one ever calls them, they're not coming back. I think we've all seen that. I see Elvin's head going. This is one of the things we talk about all the time. And people could say, well, what does that have to do with nominating? It has a lot to do with it, because how are you going to find those people if they're not where you can see them? Many of you may be aware that with NLRC, we used to go out pre-pandemic to different states, and we would observe and we would be on the lookout for some of these great people that have a lot of capability and capacity, as been discussed earlier. This year's a little different, but we had even more opportunity because of the virtual conventions and conferences to really be able to see how other people throughout the nation engage. Well, we see this happening at a unit level. I know in my school district, every one of our PTAs has had to do virtual meetings. They have gone from having 10 people to having 50 people. It's an opportunity. So while that nominating committee, which Diana and Elvin talked about, and Denise said, don't wait to the last minute, they've had all this opportunity to watch all these people on these virtual meetings to see what of these competencies are they bringing forward? Who is coming up with ideas out of the box that if we were in person, they may not have been able to come because they didn't have a babysitter. So now we actually have a bigger pool to look at, but we need to engage them. We can't just, oh, thank you for doing this, but we don't need you right now. Cultivate those talents. I think we've talked about that some already. Diana, you spoke quite a bit about that. And I think it's just so critical. We have to identify, but then mentoring is going to make a big difference. And one of the things with empowering that I always like to kind of talk about is, people talk about delegation and then they talk about empowerment. And a lot of times they talk like it's the same thing. Well, delegation is when I say, Diana, I'd like you to take care of this, and this is how I'd like you to do it. But then I turn around and I say to Denise, I'd like you to take care of this. Let me know when it's done. And if you need any guidance or you got any questions, give me a call. The more you do of that, if they're ready for it, because I'm not saying everybody's ready for empowerment right away, but as a leader and as a nominating committee, be on the lookout for those people that are at those different levels at different times. If someone needs someone to tell them something every single time, maybe they're not quite ready to be your president, but maybe they'd be great as a treasurer, because they actually are more about asking every single question about where is that check going. We've all seen those, right? We've all had them in our meetings, but that's a plus. Sometimes you got to look at the things that may appear to one person as a weakness may actually be a strength that you've been looking for. And those gaps are going to drive our future engagement. They're going to make a difference in our case as NLRC to what states we go to. If we see there's a gap in states that maybe are in the central area, right now we don't have that, but if we did, that might be where we would sign up for more conventions and conferences and go out and see if we can find more leaders. You can do the same things in your own states and in your own units. Nurture any new skills you see. There are new things coming up all the time. How many of us thought 2 years ago that Zooming would be the word and the verb of the day? That, I don't know how many times we've depended on our high school kids to help us through some of this. And that's another thing. Don't forget, if you're a PTSA at a higher level, that your nominating committee look at your bylaws. You always got to look at your bylaws, but don't forget that students can get engaged too. And we are not always tapping into that. And they want to help and they know what they want and what is needed. And the last thing I wanted to talk about from this slide is PTA e-learning. This is available on the National PTA website. And it was interesting, just the other day, I was helping to charter and do new training for a new special education PTSA that we have in our state. And the first question they ask is there e-learning? And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, wow, I want to keep an eye on this person because they are asking the right question. They don't just want us to teach them. They want to take it the next step and dig. And I would also mention, yes, National has awesome e-learning, but many of your states or other states around you, go looking at other states' websites, do have e-learning as well. And I do recommend that you look at those if there's something you're looking for you cannot find. Elvin, can you go to the next slide, please? It's not just on the outside. And this is referencing looking at diversity, which we've all talked about quite a bit. But again, just to reiterate, diversity can be many different things. And we often look at that. Age, gender, skin color, language or culture, grade level, if you're in a unit, neighborhood, sexual preference, all of these items will come up. And a lot of times when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, we don't think of all of those items. And I think all of that is very important when we're trying to look out as a nominating committee for how do we look like Diana said, our students. And Elvin, I think that takes us to your next slide to kind of do some wrap up with us.
Well, Bonnie, you guys have shared some excellent points as it relates to the nuts and bolts, really, of the work of nominating committees. And before we segue into the next portion of our presentation, we want to remind you that NLRC is here to help. You can always reach out to NLRC for ideas, any questions that you may have. And of course, you can reach us via email at leadershiprecruitment@pta.org. Again, that email address is leadershiprecruitment@pta.org. So we want to encourage you to continue dropping your questions in the chat. We see that members from NLRC are already engaging you there. But we want to take a few minutes and just kind of candidly, I want to take opportunity to ask you guys a couple of questions, if I may. And Bonnie, I think I'm going to start with you. You know, you talked a whole lot about the competencies and things of that nature. Share with me some of your experience with regards to the nominating process at a council level, because of course we are presenting information here today that is useful at every level of PTA, but specifically share a little bit about your experiences at the council level.
So in New York State, we do have councils. We also have a bigger level called a region, and that can be multiple counties. Every state's a little bit different. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those because I have had the opportunity to be on those. I currently am helping with one. And one of the key things I would say is it's with the pandemic, it has become even more difficult to find individuals to have the opportunity to give their time to do this. So it makes it even more critical to look at your bylaws right up front, get that timeline down. It doesn't always happen that way. Life happens. And sometimes, no matter what level you're at, you can all of a sudden be at, oh my goodness, because of everything got pushed off because of what's happening. Now we got to get going. So what I would say is, if you find yourself in a situation at whatever level, just get the correct people together by your bylaws, bring them together. I always like to start out a meeting by sharing the bylaws and saying exactly what it is we are supposed to be doing, how many people are supposed to be on that particular committee, because it's different from unit to unit, council to council. Everybody's are different. So you always want to look at that, and you want to have the right representation, because a really good nominating committee, usually at those levels, are made up of a combination of people that are from the board and from the general membership. And many times that general membership, at least in our state, and I believe it's in others, has to be elected to be on there. And you normally have to have alternates. And in this day and age, it's really critical to have alternates because everybody's schedules, everyone's busy trying to get the kids here or there. So what I would say from that is what we also try to do is take on what our national and state has done. And we actually did a letter of interest, and we put it out there in a Google form, gave people time to all of using, in our state, we use Member Hub. So we were able to get that out to any of the unit officers within our particular region. And then they were able to go in by a certain time period and get back to us. So that's a little bit of the nuts and bolts. It's not that much different, but I will say, because you're talking multiple counties, just like for many of your councils in other states, they may include multiple counties. It's really important and difficult sometimes to get that representation and to bring everyone together. I mean, a simple enough question came up to me, somebody from another county, is how would we sign checks? You know, so really listen to people. And also, I think, Denise, it was you that said, building the time for not everyone to say yes, because that is what you are going to find. So just do your best, come up with what you can, because it is not always simple or easy. As much as you can stay away from the recycling, you will. But the key is to start earlier in the year, go to events when we can. If you can't, go online, be on the lookout for those people to welcome in.
Thank you, Bonnie. And, you know, you raise again and reinforce really an interesting point that Denise brought up. You know, a lot of times we get nominating committees are historically backed into timelines. You start early. When should you be working? Always. Mm-hmm. Like you mentioned, if you're somewhere, and I know that through my time with NLRC, anywhere that I go, and it's quote unquote on assignment or not, I'm always on the lookout. Within my own state, if I'm attending something somewhere else, you're always looking for talent. And the good thing about it, those people are not necessarily hidden gems all the time. A lot of times they stick out like a sore thumb. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking, you can find folks. And again, like you said, prevent the recycling. Denise, I want to ask you a question. Mm-hmm. With regards to, of course, having been a state president, talk to me a little bit about your experience with state level nominating committees, because aside from our mission, I think the fact that we all must have a nominating committee is probably the only thing that's consistent across 54 Congresses, right? Everything, but they all look different. They may all function a little bit different, but share with me a little bit about your state level experience with the nominating committee.
Okay. Kansas is a petite state, so we have a small base. Sometimes your guys' counties in the large space are bigger than our whole state population. So we do stipulate that out of the 8 regions in Kansas, our nominating committee has to be represented by at least 3. And that way we do get that representation, that geography, that ability to find leaders in new places. But I think the one thing that I want to encourage everybody to do is when you're looking at that new leader is sometimes you'll get a leader will say, oh, you can't have my person. Allow them to be involved in more than one level. Give them the grace to be able to make that choice for themselves. Please don't make it for them, because most of us know how to balance our lives. We figured it out somewhere along the way. And please make sure that we're not closing a door to someone before we've ever invited them in. And I think the other thing too is remember always inclusion. It does not do you any good to bring those people to the table and then tell them they can't talk. So make sure that you are welcoming them in, their ideas, their thoughts, who they represent, who they are. We're a team. And I'm not going to go on any more than that because I think we're getting close to time. So I'm going to give everyone an opportunity.
And of course, you put a group of talkers together. This is what you get. But I really like the idea that you mentioned where so many of your regions have to be represented, because the thing is, in some of the larger states, there are still very rural areas, and there are some leaders there that have just been waiting to be noticed. So I think that's a great thing. And then you talked a little bit about what I call Pta poaching. There are people that think, oh, you're coming to get my people. No, guess what? These are great leaders that will better serve the association, and sometimes serve the association at different levels at the same time. I hate hearing the idea of, well, Denise, she's got to come up through the ranks. There are no ranks. If you're willing to serve, there's a place for you in PTA. There's no such thing as PTA poaching. So, Diana, I want to wrap it up with you really quickly. And we talked a little bit about competencies. We talked a little bit about the gap analysis. And of course, we go extremely in depth with this at the national level. I do believe that the first time we did this, I saw like smoke coming out of your ears, right? But talk a little bit about how that could benefit state and council level leadership if they were to conduct such like small gap analysis and things of that nature.
So one of the things that I think we need to remind ourselves constantly is that we are running a nonprofit. It doesn't matter if you're at a local school, a council, a region, or a state. That just depends on the size of your nonprofit, right? But I think looking at a gap analysis, does somebody have a fiscal background? Does somebody have a communications background? Does somebody have a policy and advocacy background? And looking at that as far as a board goes to make sure that you're representing the different areas of our association and the overall arching goals of your local PTA, the state PTA, and national PTA. Because if you're looking at a strand, we all are looking for these types of leaders. But if you're not actually looking to see who's leaving, if you're at a grammar school, which a lot of our PTAs are made up of K-6, who is that leader that's in 6th grade that's going to be moving to the middle school? And what competencies or skills did they have that made the PTA work so well? And do you have some new leaders that can actually fit those same things? So I would say it's not something that we've done at a local level. I have never done it as a local leader. The other thing I never did as a local leader was look for my replacement because I was just too busy doing my job. So I think taking those moments to make sure that not only are we really taking a look at what we're going to be losing out on, but looking for people that can replace our own skill set, because the bottom line is we cannot be doing these jobs forever. Eventually, we do need to retire and let space be for new leaders to come in. And so those would be some of my recommendations and some of the things that I think is important to look at, even at a local level. You do have a lot of paperwork that's required by the IRS or your franchise tax boards of each of your states or your attorney general's office with charitable trusts. Those are skills and information that you need somebody on your boards to be aware of. And so taking a look at those competencies and what you're going to be missing out on, I think are critical. But thanks, Alvin, for thinking of asking me the last question, and for everybody being here today. I've appreciated being part of the NLRC process at National PTA. And I just want to encourage all of you, like Alvin said, to be putting in for an LOI for the next term, because that is coming up by October.
Yeah, the LOI will be launching soon. Thanks for the plug there, Diana. And, you bring up a lot of interesting points. And again, this is a whole nother workshop. But so much of what we do as volunteer leaders, as nonprofit managers, really, transfers outside of PTA. So, we build a lot of skills in PTA that will transfer to the private sector. I've had an absolute plum-pleasing time being with you ladies today. And of course, we want to encourage you to keep your questions coming in the chat. And of course, if for some reason there's a question that we can't get to today in the chat, make certain that you reach out to us via email at leadershiprecruitment@pta.org. It has been my pleasure, ladies, to serve as your chair this year. And I bid you all very good luck as your journey continues with NLRC. So again, we welcome each of you, and we hope that you have a phenomenal time at National PTA's virtual convention this year. And we encourage you to make certain that you stay tuned to the convention app to make certain that you know when the next general session is happening, when all of the goings on will be happening. So thank you for joining us today. And most importantly, we look to see you on the journey in PTA leadership.